So without further ado, I'll introduce Martin Jorgensen. He's the Head of Digital Learning at a Virtual School Victoria, VSV, and he's also the current Acting Assistant Principal for Curriculum and Pedagogy at VSV. So take it away, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great to see so many people dropped in all of it in the last couple of seconds. This has been a big onrush, so that's fantastic. As I was saying to Nathan, I have been fairly ambitious in how much I think I can get through today, so we'll see how we go. And I'll move through fairly briskly, I think, through the content in order that, as Nathan was saying, it's going to be hard, perhaps a little bit more challenging to keep abreast of the chat while I'm doing that. So what I might do is we'll switch this on. So what you should see across the top of your screen is a slides address, web address. So if you've got a question that you want to ask on the way through, and I'll try and address those sort of midpoint or at the end, most likely, but if you've got a question, you can navigate to that address and ask the question. You can also vote up or down other questions that are there that you feel are more relevant to your interests, and then I'll sort of keep an eye on those questions as we move through. And if there are any that I feel like I can jump on straight away, I will. If I'm aware that there's content coming up that I'm going to speak to anyway, I might defer to that. Or you might like to open that browser open that link on your phone, perhaps. So I'm going to move on. Just a reminder, as Nathan said, for those people that are just dropping in now, just to please keep your microphone on mute. You should have been muted on entry, but please just keep that on mute. So my name's Martin Jorgensen. As Nathan said, I'm Digital Learning Leader for Virtual School Victoria and current AP for Curriculum and Pedagogy. We have about 5,000 students, online students, with us each year, a little bit more than that now. Most of our students are not remote, and that's a really common misconception. Only about 3% of the students are with us for that reason, and more than half of those students have serious social, emotional, medical reasons that they are with us. So, and that's for a whole range of things from serious trauma to bullying to really just not being able to navigate traditional school environments as I said, for a range of reasons. We have about 250 courses within a Moodle platform. Moodle is our principal LMS, but we use a range of tools. So we've got many subjects that use Google Classroom. We've got subjects that use Microsoft products. We've got Moodle as the base for that, but we use a huge range of platforms and LMS platforms depending on the subject and the subject area. So I've got a good amount of experience in many of those platforms. Had a good amount of experience over the years. Course development at VSV is quite a significant undertaking, and I think it's probably worth pointing this out before we move too far in, because what we do isn't necessarily reflective in some respects to what schools are contending with right now. And so what I've tried to do in this presentation is to pull out the parts that are most relevant. Our program development takes a year for, let's say, a VCE study. It involves a teacher at 0.6 to 0.8 for some, writing most of their week on that study for the year. And then we have a multimedia team that produces the multimedia objects for the course, content editors, that just look at grammar, and we've got a user experience team that look at the layout and functionality of the program, and then we have instructional leaders that guide those programs. So it's a pretty significant undertaking. Many teams are involved in the production of a course. I guess I should also point out that we achieve good results, and it seems like a strange thing to have to point out, but I think there's a lot in the press at the moment about online settings and whether they are produce a stronger an environment, a successful and learning environment for students. Absolutely, they do. You can absolutely achieve very strong results in an online setting. And there are some subjects where we score higher than others. There's some that we do very well across well above state average, and others that we're sort of on state average. But I think that's an important point to outline. I guess many of you are going to want to know how to make learning meaningful in a hurry. What do you need to know now, and what do how to reflect on what you've already learned, and how to build transferable skills. And I guess this is one of the principal things that I wanted to cover in the presentation was, well, you're learning a whole lot at the moment about what can and what's not working for you, and then you're going to bring that knowledge back to your classroom. And so what sort of models, what sort of theories are helpful in that reflection? I'm going to cover a little bit of that as I go. I think as I said, the Google Slides offers this audience participation. No questions in there yet, but please do pop your questions in there if you've got any along the way. I've also probably worth pointing out that I've chosen to use WebEx for this presentation, my personal room for WebEx, because it's the DEET preferred platform. That's pretty much the reason, and DEET has put a whole lot of hardware into schools across Victoria, that employ this platform. And so I thought, and it is the one that we've just switched over to from Adobe Connect, with the licensing concluding with Adobe Connect across the state. So I really thought it was probably helpful to also present in an environment that I'm sure that many of you are also perhaps somewhat new to, that it's probably helpful to choose that platform. The first thing I'm going to talk about, excitingly, is learning theory, because it's one that I love and I use with teachers at VSV. Every new teacher, in fact, I have a role in the induction of every new teacher, and we take on about between 50 and 60 staff each year. And the reason for that is that our enrolment runs all year. So we start off the year with about 2,500 to 2,500 students, and we build across the year to about 5,000 students. And so we take on a lot of staff as we go. So every staff member that begins with us, I talk about this model, TPAC. And for some of you that I'm not going to talk briefly, I'm only going to talk fairly briefly about this, but it's a learning theory introduced by Punya Mishra and Matthew Coella. It's based on a whole lot of work that Lee Shulman did in the 80s. And the reason that its value, if you like, and the reason it's important, and the reason I talk to every new teacher at VSV about it, is that it helps us to understand the relationship between the three principal areas of knowledge that teachers use every day. So this, along with a couple of other things that I'm going to cover in this presentation, I'll touch on briefly with perhaps an understanding or appreciation that you might want to delve a little bit more deeply in your own time after the presentation. So the three circles, the one at the top is T for technology, and then C for content, and P for pedagogy, technological, pedagogical, content knowledge, bit of a mouthful. And so its value is in the relationship between those three areas of knowledge. For example, if you're planning a lesson for your students, what's the best pedagogical approach married with the right technological approach? So for example, what pedagogy should I apply to that particular type of technology? What pedagogical approach should I use for that type of content in my subject, the subject that you're teaching? Or what sort of content is best delivered in a particular type of technology? So it explores the relationship between those areas of knowledge. For example, you might use an online forum, and you choose that, and you might have chosen that model because that particular type of technology because you can see that it offers the best type of collaborative approach, which is the pedagogical approach that you're taking. You might decide that you want students to contribute over a number of days as well, and give them time for reflection. So the forum allows them that opportunity rather than a live. Perhaps the alternative might be a live lesson. I guess the strength of the TPAC model is that it helps me recognise, what technology is going to be most appropriately suited to that particular type of content. It helps us ask the right questions of the technology that we're employing, and I guess that principally is its value to you as you're exploring new types of technologies in delivery of classes with your students. The model also has a ring around it, which is there to remind us of the many intrusions that we have to contend with when we're in a classroom online. In an online environment, you might have be contending with students that have a difficult home life. I mean, they may well be experiencing trauma. You know, mum and dad might be working in the house, and which means they can't support a live lesson, which brings its own challenges. So all of those existing, or might also cover students with existing conditions. So you might have a student with ASD or anxiety or depression. So it helps us to then reflect on, well, if I've chosen a forum for the type of technology that I'm going to use, is that right for that type of intro, for that type of additional challenge, that additional type of context? Is a forum the right choice for a student with high anxiety, for example? TechPack helps us to unpick our approaches to teaching and learning with technology and making sure that we've got the right balance of content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and that we've chosen the type of technology that's going to help us reach the sorts of outcomes that we're looking for. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of TPAC, and I know I have raced through that, but I really felt it was important to lead with it because I find it particularly valuable in the professional development that we do with staff at VSB, and it's a really good reflective model for teachers. You can see on that image that there's www.tpac.org. I'd really encourage you to have a bit of a look there. They've got some really accessible resources around the use of TPAC. Now you've got TPAC in mind, I'd like to look at how we can best support young people in classrooms online. What is there at VSV that can be adapted to traditional school environments that have now been very, very quickly forced to go 100% online? And there's a great deal of what we prioritise at VSV, as I said, although earlier, it would be familiar to you. So although, as I said earlier, our program development is significant, student relationships are right at the centre of everything that we are focused on when we're developing those programs. And that's in line, I'm sure, with your own priorities. It's at the centre of our work. Student relationships are at the centre of our pedagogical model, which was developed within VSV. So part of the challenge, I guess, for you that you're uncovering in teaching online is that you're all becoming familiar with is that I guess, it takes a good deal of thought to work out what that relationship development looks like in an online setting. And, a big part of that is teacher's voice. How you integrate teacher's voice into your classroom is a really principal question that you should be asking. Teachers in a traditional classroom environment ask between 200 and 300 questions a day on average. And if you think about all of that reassurance that you give your students in your classroom environment, all the little comments and consolations you give, the physiological feedback that you exchange with your students, all of that comfort and reassurance about in developing a safe environment, all of the discussions that fill your day, how do you translate that into an online setting? It's really critical to think about that. Online schooling can be a really isolating experience. Our current circumstances are, for many students across the state, pretty traumatic. And I've got 3 kids at home, a 9-year-old, a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old, all contending with this on a daily basis. So I'm certainly seeing it in our classrooms at VSV, but I'm also seeing it at home. How do you translate that teacher's voice into the online setting? Well, there are 3 ways that I'm going to talk about related to that are particularly important. I guess before I launch into those though, look, a model for developing those relationships, or a model for developing a structured approach to building relationships online is a good one to refer to as Simmons' model. Simmons' work's really accessible. She's got a sort of a small booklet that outlines the principles of her 5-stage process. I'm not going to look at that in detail because we haven't got a huge amount of time today, but I would just encourage you, if you're looking for a staged approach to development of relationships over a period of time, her model is really accessible and can help you determine what to prioritise early in building strong relationships online, and what you should be working towards. So we've found it really helpful in our program development, but also just in reflecting on at the start of the year on what sort of how long we might need, for example, to build those basic navigation needs that students might have around just figuring out how to navigate the online environment that we've selected for them. And I think it's really important that we're thinking about this because, many of the students, as I said earlier, they're experiencing trauma. There's also the Swinburne study I was reading not that long ago that was run last year about 1 in 4 younger Victorians, 12 to 18, being recognising that they're lonely. So add to that the further isolation of them being at home, trying to navigate online spaces, trying to connect to classrooms with environments that they might find frustrating. It's important to have a really structured approach to building those relationships. In any event, we'll go back to voice, and I think perhaps the principal tool that I would encourage you to think about using is audio recordings. So audio recording tools are terrific because there are hundreds of options out there, and my strong suggestion would be to look for the simpler ones. It doesn't really matter what sort of device you're using. There'll be an audio recording tool on it, and I think Windows laptops, the one on the Windows laptops is Voice Recorder. I think it's just called Voice Recorder, but I mean, you'll find many quick and easy to use audio tools online as well. I think audio is great because it's quick and easy to record. The file sizes are really small, so it's easy to embed within files within online environments where video can take a little bit longer to produce and then also to embed within your online environment. And it can be perhaps it can seem more straightforward to use text, and certainly this is what I'm seeing perhaps with my own children's experiences online, and that it can be perhaps a little quick, a little bit more brisk to just put a textual comment in there. But audio is a terrific way of embedding your voice into those materials and really providing the context for them for the information that you're trying to convey to your students, whether it's instructional feedback or whatever it happens to be. I'm just going to have a quick look at just a quick question about Jill's work. If you just Google Jilly salmon, as in the fish, you'll find 12 links and 100 images. She's and as I said, she's very accessible. So one of the great things about audio is you can really use it in a way that helps you to provide context for the content, as I was saying. So this is perhaps a quick example of how that might work. So you can see from that first little audio file that I've got there, that you might use an audio file to provide the lens through which they view that content. So particularly if it's a challenging text, you might drop a little audio file ahead of the content just to say, look, this is going to be a little bit confronting, or this is going to be a challenging text, but this is the way that I'd like you to view it. This is the way to take notes or to reflect upon it. I think if you drop a document in front of your students in the classroom, you would never drop it unannounced. You would always hand that document out to your students or provide access to it in the classroom on their laptops, or however it's most easily conveyed. But your voice would be there to guide them through their experience of that document. Your voice would be, I guess, the principal technology, the principal device that you would use to in the reading of that, to support the reading of that text, and it's no different online. And I think you've got to plan for how you're going to embed your voice around text in the way that I've provided an example of, to provide that comfort and support for students in that just-in-time context. You wanted that voice in the same way that they'd be able to put up their hand in the classroom and say, I'm challenged by this. You want them to be able to refer to your audio file that accompanies that text to really give them that context and support. I think you can also use it to motivate students to move through content, whether that's instructional feedback or whatever it happens to be. So you can see that I've got one midpoint of the text. Now that might be as a way of supporting some broader vocabulary adoption. You might have it as a way of providing an exemplar for some of the language that's being used in the text, or just simply reading some of the text to your students from that passage to give them a sense of pace and tenor within the text. I think it's interesting to look at some of the publishers that are putting material on over the last couple of years. Some of those digital audio texts that they're producing where, they might, some of those electronic texts that they're providing where they might have a passage of text in just the way I've displayed it here, and then an audio file where the author reads a small passage, and then another text, passage of text to read. So audio is really powerful. You can see that there next to Jack, that image of Jack there, there's another audio file to provide, so that you might use it to provide context and around the relationship of the image and the text. So explaining the relationship between them. And this is something we commonly do at VSV in our online programs to help support the students as they're working their way through the course. The more opportunities you have to embed that voice, the better. The second approach into embedding voice in your classroom is using screencasting. So if you've already familiar with screencasting, you will know the benefits of using a screencasting tool. If you're not familiar with it, look, I would strongly encourage you to have a bit of a look at what's available to you. While our courses are significant, we have whole teams for recording audio and recording video for our courses, but we also need our teachers to be able to be nimble in their delivery of their programs. So as student needs change, or we really need to empower the teachers at VSV to be able to quickly and nimbly adapt to those needs. And one of the ways you do that is using a tool like Screencasting to quickly record instructional material that they can modify their courses with. But it's also amazing for feedback. If you're looking for, and incidentally, when I'm giving my own student feedback, I don't exclusively use screencasting, but I use it, 80 to 90% of my feedback is through screencasting tools. Mike Henderson and Mike Phillips at Monash have done a lot of work around this, and over a number of years. And I guess it's really important to have a reflective framework when you're delivering feedback through video. So if you're looking for a structured approach and you're interested in digging a little further into using screencasting for feedback, and I would strongly advise it. I certainly have cut down on the amount of time that I provide feedback to my students using screencasting tools, and I feel like it's more effective as well. Then Mike Henderson and Mike Phillips' work at Monash is really useful. I can share a link at the end of the presentation to their work. And there's a link in my blog if you're interested in having a look at some of their models that the feedback models that they've got. It's great for recording. Screencasting, as I said, is great for recording instruction. And my experience is that students often prefer it. When I provide feedback, I provide my students with an opportunity to provide anonymous feedback on my feedback. So I get pretty honest, reflective feedback back on the feedback I'm providing my students. And fairly consistently, overwhelmingly, they are stunned at the time that you've taken the time to provide video feedback, and they don't need to know really that it's taken you perhaps less than notes in the margin. And they really benefit, I think, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it allows them to watch and rewatch the video recordings, and I've done a lot of study of my own feedback and other teachers at VSV around how many times they watch that video. Really interesting that some students will watch that video feedback repeatedly. I think interesting as well, often they'll use a collective to describe their experience of watching the feedback. So they'll say, when we watched this, or when I watched this with mum. So often that gives you an added opportunity to be able to pitch the feedback to the student, but also to their parent, and say, actually, a really good thing that mum can do with you is to read out your work to you so that you can listen for fluency, or whatever it happens to be. I won't spend any more time on that. As I said, I'm trying to race through, but you'll find that screencasting tools are cheap. They're a fantastic, I don't know, what you call it, quick and dirty tool to use, where you can really briskly provide instructional material or feedback for students in a really timely way, and it's a really rich experience for students, and it gives them an opportunity to have a much stronger voice with them at home when they need it. Obviously, the last thing that you'll be doing with your students is online lessons, and this is a terrific and principal way to ensure that there's a strong voice in your classroom. Just having a look at the questions. Jane's asking best current tools for screencasting. I'll use Screencast-O-Matic, but I know that on my iPad there are a couple of really terrific tools. Screencast-O-Matic is, it's a pretty good one, but I mean, as I said, there are lots out there. A quick Google and you'll find 12 different options. Screencast-O-Matic is the one that we've ended up adopting at VSV just because it's quite simple and straightforward to use. Often, I'll get back to online lessons, online classes, as we're increasingly calling them. Often at VSV, we'll find that an online class can be a really good opportunity to work with the materials that we've already provided in the course. So many of our students will often need that further focus and reassurance to pace them through the materials. And I think that what I'm seeing of teachers that are outside of VSV is that they're quickly realising the need for that, to walk the students through the Google Classroom space and help them to navigate what they need to attend to that week and do some of that work live in the classroom, live in that online class. We often provide them with a social opportunity at the beginning and the end of the lesson. For some of these students, many of these students across the state, this is their only time to really have face-to-face discussion. So really strongly I'd encourage you to do that. And some of those simple things that you would do in your classroom, like establishing protocols, are always really important. And, having really pointed learning intentions at the beginning of the lesson, really important. I think you'll find that, I'm sure you're already finding that the pace of a lesson, it moves pretty briskly. That 45 minutes, which is about what I would recommend pitching towards. If we find that that's the sweet spot, about 45 minutes of where you start maybe losing students beyond that point. That it can be exhausting to be participating in an online class in a way it's perhaps more so than a physical classroom, and you find that you really have to be on your game and have a very pointed learning intention for that class, because if you try to cover too much ground, you'll find that you quickly run out of time. So I think there are some tools in most online classroom settings that are online classroom resources that are online classroom tools that are really effective. The polling tools particularly are brilliant for repeated checks for understanding and being. I think it's really important, even in those classes where you've got students that you might see their video, they might appear to be attentive, but if they're not inclined to participate in the chat, and maybe that's because they've got slow typing skills or a range of reasons, or just a lack of confidence in participating in that way, it's really important that you're giving them repeated opportunities to provide their voice in the discussion. So polling tools are a really good way of allowing everybody's voice to be heard, and for you to do those repeated temperature checks in your classroom to check for understanding. I think electronic hand up, those sorts of tools are there as well. I think it's really important to keep in mind that your students are likely to have a dozen other tabs open that you're competing against. So there might be an Instagram tab and a Pinterest tab and whatever else is up at the same time. And certainly, every year I run several user experience sessions with students where I bring a big group of students into the school, and often they don't know each other other than experiences online. And we spend a good 3/4 of a day together exploring how they learn and how they what they prefer in their mode of in the platforms that they're using with us in terms of their best learning experience. So that might be tweaking the navigation or talking about how to best approach a discussion, or they like those regular checks is definitely a frequent feedback in those sessions. They like that kind of quick and responsive ongoing assessment as a way of being able to represent what their feelings are on that subject. Don't rest on the fact that they might be the one that they might put forward their view voluntarily. I'd be seeking it out each time. I guess don't forget your thinking hats as well, here, or, it's taking on a role can really embolden some students and give them permission perhaps to be more assertive. And so some of those sorts of approaches can be really helpful. I think you also need to accept that some students are just going to lurk in the background of your online classroom, and just getting them there can be a win. And certainly, for some of our students that have significant social emotional challenges in our classrooms, that's, that might be their learning, their goal for that, for that 3 weeks or that 8 weeks or whatever it happens to be, is just to get there and to be participating on a low level. And then, using Salmon or usually Salmon's work, or, using a really structured approach will slowly bring them in, perhaps by preloading them with, what's going to be covered in the lesson, and perhaps even talking to them about preparing some statements that they can cut and paste into a chat room when they hit the lesson the next day. What else? Our SEL program, our social emotional learning program, we've certainly found to have been having enormous success with it over the last few years. And I would strongly encourage, if you haven't got one running at the moment, to start thinking about how you might structure a social emotional learning course online for your students, because we've found it really been of enormous benefit. Empathy is harder to encourage online. Context is definitely something that we know young adults really struggle with in online settings. And you can, there's a number of studies around that. PEW have a number of studies around that, around struggles with contextual information in online settings particularly. So, misreading of comments and in context is rife amongst young adults. SEL helps you, encounter and then overcome some of those bumps and appreciate how to learn together effectively in those online settings. I'm sure many of you are using tools like Kahoots. We also use Google Docs a lot in our online lessons to help students to monitor, for the teacher to be able to monitor independently what the students are working on. So there might be an introductory discussion for 10 minutes, and then students will go into independent documents and do some quiet, some independent work for a while the teacher is flitting between those documents during the live lesson and perhaps providing some independent advice within the documents themselves. And I guess the other thing to perhaps point out is don't leave them on their own either. Don't be afraid to leave them on their own in the classroom either to do some independent work. I know that it can feel odd to say I'm switching off the mic for 10 minutes, but it's really important that you're giving them a bit of a break. And as I said, it can be exhausting being on, in an online class, and giving them an opportunity to work quietly and independently for a shorter period of time. Good for you, good for them. I guess the other thing is to avoid too many transitions with digital tools. The cognitive burden can be pretty high if you're moving between multiple digital tools, and it can be really challenging to, simply to move from one method of navigation, say from the online class space to Google Tools to a Kahoot to something else. So keep that in mind, that that cognitive burden is something that you really want to be considering as you're planning out your learning sequences. Collaboration and trust, I think, are really really important considerations, and Julie Salmon's work can help you there. Really thinking about how you work towards building empathy in those online spaces is important. Small groups are really important too. It can be a lot harder to develop trust in an online setting, and small groups with a long gestation can be a good way of overcoming some of that. I think it's an interesting conflict with, if you're looking at best practice in differentiation in a classroom space, and you wanting to be working around, working with different students, you're wanting opportunities to, within your classroom for students to work with a range of other students of different ability levels and interests. But in an online setting, while that's still true, it can be much harder to build those connections, and it takes longer to build those connections. So it's an interesting pressure point in online settings. I think, just connection is king is perhaps the takeaway from if you take one thing away from that. Giving your students lots of opportunities to connect in synchronous and asynchronous spaces is really important. I think one of the things to look for when you're reviewing your work as well is silos of learning. But just before I jump into that, I've got a few questions there. Daryl's asking, how do you assess whether students are disengaged from online content? those checks for understanding, using polling, providing them with opportunities to all make a contribution to us to the chat space with a really brief contribution, for example, I think can be really powerful and easy to forget, easy to make really big assumptions about what your students are doing or what they're attending to. I think it can be really easy to when you don't have all of that physiological feedback, and you can't look around the room and look for disinterest and someone's staring out the window over there, and it's easy to make assumptions about their level of attentiveness. So that those constant, using hands up or using those checks for understanding become really important in an online setting. Is it possible to see some lesson content examples? I think that I might be pressed a little bit too firmly for time. That's one of the audience questions there. But I'll see how we go by the end of the lesson. If I can jump in there at the end, I will. As I said, one of the things about silos for learning that I'm aware of that you need to be perhaps conscious of is individual activities that aren't closely associated enough in your sequence of learning. So a student's discussion in a forum, for example, is great, but if it's quickly forgotten because you've moved on to the next digital tool, the next interaction, the value of that digital tool in the chat space is reduced. So in other words, if you don't use what students have contributed in that online space, in that forum, they're going to start valuing it less, and they'll be less likely to use that digital tool effectively the next time. Perhaps a good analogy or a good example from a classroom perspective might be a digital whiteboard. If you've got a big digital whiteboard in the corner of your room, but you rarely use it, or it just becomes a coat stand, then they devalue it, and in terms of its, there's a number of studies about it, being devalued as a learning object in your classroom. So the same is true online. You want to be really careful to be valuing their contributions, and the best way to do that is to work with the knowledge that they're constructing in those tools. And I guess, so what I would suggest is looking closely at how each part of the lesson integrates and supports the next. And we do this in classrooms, physical classrooms, bricks and mortar classrooms, really fluidly. You move from an independent discussion to a group discussion, and you'll explain the reasons for the transition as you're moving through Think, Bear, Share, for example. You provide students with a metacognitive understanding of why you're shifting focus or activity. And as you're bringing students together, back into a whole class discussion, you might say, like, let's get together and find out what we know about blah. You show them in an online setting. Showing them in an online setting is just as important. And I think, how you do that is a really crucial consideration. So, for example, that chat room discussion that I was talking about. So, chat room discussions are gold. I can't emphasize that enough. So, I mean, if you've got students contributing in a forum, you want to show them the value of that contribution. Use the record of that discussion, and use that transcript in the subsequent lesson. You show them the value of the chat room as a learning tool, but you also show and you show them that their contribution in that sort of space is valued. I'm sure many of you have, perhaps a good way of describing it is, I put up a post on Facebook the other day, and I got maybe 2 likes from it, and it was a very late post in Facebook. But it still felt a little bit harsh, even though I knew it wasn't personal. It still felt like I was a little bit ignored, right? If you're dropping a contribution into a chat room and then it's not attended to by anyone, it doesn't get responded to, and then it's forgotten, well, you're certainly far less likely to attend to it the next time, aren't you? Attend to, have the same significance of your response the next time. So you need to show the students the value of those contributions. And I guess building that community of learners is challenging online. So using the transcript is a really good way of working towards that kind of unity. In this example, you've got the examples of you've got the transcript. You can use it as a ranking task in your next online lesson. You can ask the students to identify for and against perhaps points that have been raised in the discussion, or unpacking key terms in the discussion. Using it really well deepens their value of their contributions, but it also deepens their value of the tool that you're using. the next, I'm racing through this. I'm aware that I've got 15 minutes, and I think I've got enough time to get through all my content. So I apologise if I'm talking at 1,000 miles a minute, but I really want to get through as much as I can as I'm pushing through this. Thinking routines. I'm just seeing a couple of questions there around questions to our live teacher. I've got just seen a question from Paul about where no live teaching time is allowed. Look, I'd be using your screencasting tools to provide students with, that opportunity to see and hear you as often as you can. Now, look, the other thing to consider is that in forum spaces, it's one thing to have a textual response, but it's quite another and we see this in our forums all the time, is that if you provide an opportunity for students and just encourage them to do a textual response, that's one thing. But if you provide students with an opportunity or you encourage them to put an audio file in there or a little video file, wow, the attentiveness of your students to contribute to that space is, it goes up a notable level. I'm just going to pause for a second to say that, look, I can hear a little bit of audio from a couple of people that have got their mics on. So if I can just ask you to suppress your mic if it's live, please, that would be really helpful. So I hope that answers your question, Paul. I think, you can really have some really lively and active discussions and lots of voice in an asynchronous space. It's just about perhaps using a little bit more media, and there are some terrific, really easy to use audio tools. 123 apps. If you just Google 123 apps, they've got a dead simple audio recorder, which is you master in about 30 seconds. So I'd encourage you to think about that. If you're still contending with which digital tools and how to use them effectively, a really great way to think about, or perhaps a model to work with, is using thinking routines to determine how to best identify the tools that you need. So, and I mean, I love the Project Zero work and visible thinking work that Harvard have done over quite a number of years in this area. In fact, if you Google Project Zero and visible thinking, you'll find there are some amazing resources out there from that Harvard team. They're really active online on Twitter as well. You can actually, if you want to reach out to them, they're really eager to, happy to respond. Some of the actions you can see here that I've outlined are really common to many thinking routines, mapping and connecting ideas and reflection and discussion. And if you can select digital tools that achieve these sorts of interactions, they're far easier to map to, they'll be far easier to map to the routines that you already, have had in your classroom and that you're trying to translate into an online space, like Think, Pair, Share. If you look at Think, Pair, Share on the left, think about the sorts of interactions on the right that are really common to routines that you might map to those three elements of discussion. So if you've got digital tools I think one of the key things to think about here, remembering student cognitive burden, if you've got digital tools that are really clear in their purpose and really straightforward in their use, mapping them to routines or mapping them to a really clear purpose in your learning sequence is easier. If you've got complex tools that try and achieve too much, digital tools that are trying to cover all the bases, they can be more complex to embed in your thinking, in your routines, in your classroom routines, and I'm also thinking about you returning to the classroom next term potentially. And let me give you a bit of example of what I mean by that. So this is a screen grab from a tool called Meister. Now, Meister is great. It's got 100 tools you can use, a huge range of features. It's amazing. This is bubble.us. This is also a terrific little mind mapping tool. Yes, it perhaps has at the outset when you're using it less features, but you don't need a login. You can get started straight away. You can start building your map, in about 30 seconds of sitting down and navigating to bubble.us in a way that, if you're working through Mindmaster, you really almost need a class or two just to familiarise students with navigating the tool and employing it to its best effect. So the reason I'm showing you these two examples is to think about, if you're trying to map a tool for reflection, for independent thinking, and you want to use a mind map, using a tool like Bubble, a really simple, straightforward digital tool that's really clear in its purpose, and it's not trying to, win the race of how many features it's got. It's much easier to slot that into your lesson planning. And I guess this is one of the things that I feel I'm really passionate about in digital learning, is that you're using, and whether that's physically in the classroom or whether this is in an online setting. I've taught in primary classrooms, in secondary classrooms, and in, for the last almost 10 years at Virtual School Victoria. If you're using digital tools with your students that are simple to use, clear in their purpose, they're more straightforward to plan with, and they're easier for students to appreciate the metacognitive benefit of those tools. Remember the chat room earlier. If the chat room is simple and straightforward, and they're focused on their contributions rather than the 50 tools to modify the sort of font that they're using, it can be easier for them to understand and appreciate the value of those tools. These are some of the principles that I use to remind myself of what a good classroom ready digital tool might have in its favor. So they've often got a really clean design. Often, although it's they're quick to master, easy for students and brisk for them to master, they do one thing really well. It's often a really telling point for me with digital tools that are good to use with students. They're linked to a clear purpose. They're good for cross-contextual use. So if you're looking at using multiple digital tools in your classroom, then whether that's a physical classroom or an online classroom, if they're really clear in their purpose, it's easier to move between those digital tools in the classroom or in an online setting, and for you to be able to articulate the benefit of each individual tool as you move to it for a different type of activity. And finally, few or no account or login constraints. It can be a deal breaker. I mean, I've certainly been in a physical classroom environment where I've had to contend with a good 20 minutes of trying to resolve student access to a particular tool because logins aren't working or what have you. So it can be really helpful. And, when you're so much further distanced from your students, to not have that as a significant concern. So tools like Bubble, easy to use. You don't need to set up an account. There's no login requirements, can be a really big benefit. What I'll do next, and I'm aware of the time, we've got about 10 minutes to go. I'm going to look really quickly at a sequence of learning with those principles in mind. So I've used most of E5 here. I've left evaluate out of this exercise. We'll pop in our thinking routine, think, pair, share. And in the first part of the routine, I think we'll probably, let's use a tool that allows students to reflect on their prior knowledge. So like a mind mapping tool like Bubble, the one that we looked at. And next, you might drop in an online forum to pair students up to allow them to share the maps that they've developed. And then finally, to draw your reflections together, I'm going to use a shared Google document to do that. Now, I think you can see that when the digital tools you're using are straightforward in their purpose, they slip into that routine that I want to use more readily. I think sometimes we're stuck with, it's true that we are stuck with the sort of digital tools that we're told to use. Paul's reflection is certainly reflective of that. Lots of schools will have platforms and restrictions around what they're allowed to use, what you're allowed to use with students. I think where possible, though, my strong recommendation would be to select tools that are really straightforward in their purpose, digital tools that, like using the principles that I've outlined, are much easier to use and much easier to discern where they fit into a sequence of learning. I think as well, once you're back in your classrooms, and that will happen in not that long, I think we'll blink and spin around and we will be there. Having a set of digital tools that are quick to employ in your classroom, dynamically, easily, that you can turn to very briskly, having tools like these at your disposal, it's a huge advantage in being able to move fluidly through a sequence of learning in a classroom environment as well. Now, I know I speak very quickly, and I am aware of that personal failing. So I know that I've barreled through this, so I will certainly stay in the space to answer some more questions at the end of this discussion. But before we get there, when it's all over and we return to classrooms, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, well, what are the tools that schools are going to use, that teachers are going to use to evaluate what's happened? And we've been thrown into this environment where we've quite a confronting environment where we've had to contend with a lot. Perhaps the pace of our reflection has been pretty brisk. If you're lucky enough to be spending time on working through inquiry with a team on what's working and what's not, that's fantastic. If you feel like you're just that you're a bit challenged in that regard, you're going to want a way of really structurally effectively reflecting on your successes and where you've been challenged in the circumstances. And I think TPAC, the model that I introduced earlier on, is a really good model that allows you to determine the benefit of tools, alongside the content and the pedagogy that you're bringing to the table. But SAMR is also a fantastic resource as an accessible model that you can use to reflect on how effectively you're using those digital tools. So as you integrate these technologies into your online classroom and when you return to your bricks and mortar classroom, SAMR is a really good way of determining whether you've really just been substituting what you were doing in the classroom to an online setting, or whether you are actually achieving more than was previously possible without technology. So you can see in the SAMR model, it takes you through 4 stages of increasing depth of use with a particular type of technology. So let's, for example, in that first stage where you're using with substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. Substitution, really you're just swapping out what you were doing before with a digital tool. You're not really taking full advantage of the online setting. Augmentation, you're starting to modify what you're doing and taking it further than just simple substitution. So substitution might simply be, instead in a classroom environment, might have been handing them, providing the students with a handout. In an online setting, it might just be emailing it to them. Augmentation might be putting that document up in an online classroom for discussion. Then modification might be working live on the document with students in a Google Classroom to modify the document and as a group. And redefinition is, completely redefining the sort of task that you might have started with because of in ways that were not possible without technology. So SAMR helps you go deep, if you like, with your technology use, and it's a good measure to put up against your planned lesson, your online lesson, to really ensure that you're taking best advantage of the tools that you're using. It can help you. It can be also really helpful to put blooms alongside it. So there's actually some really good examples of SAMR and blooms together to see whether you're also targeting those, those higher order cognitive skills that you're trying to develop. This image, by the way, is one from Sylvia Duckworth, who has some really lovely hand-drawn educational images that are really worth a look. Sylvia Duckworth is her name. So that's about all from me today. I guess if I'm asking you to take some things away, that'd certainly be to use your routines that you're already familiar with, the ones that are already in your muscle memory, like think, pair, share, and think about how you might redefine them in an online setting if you're not already doing that, because I think that they make it really much easier to determine which digital tools you can marry to those different segments of your thinking routines that you're already employing. And I think using digital tools that are really clear in their purpose and that follow the principles that I outlined earlier, you can access those principles. A little copy of those on my blog if you're interested. Just martinjorgensen.com is how you get there. And lots of audio and video. I can't overstate that enough. I mean, it's true for VSV courses, and it really helps to overcome some of those isolation struggles that students struggle with, but also that really significant notion of students struggling with context in their setting. It can really help to overcome some of those misunderstandings that are easy to miss unless you're doing repeated checks for understanding in your live lessons, and providing them with those opportunities to reflect back as soon as they've finished a task using use of audio files and that sort of thing. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming along. I'm just going to have a little bit of a look at the questions that were asked. Thank you, Deborah, for putting that in there, and Lisa for putting those links in there. I really appreciate it. Project Zero links, fantastic. All right. Really hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. I know I barrel through things very briskly, but really happy to answer further questions if you have them. What I might do is just stop sharing my